talking about Sesarma crabs, which has occupied my thoughts and kept me up at night for the last 20 years. It's good to see a good portion of this audience knows about them. All right. There we go. All right, so top left corner, that's a Sesarma crab. They are a natural component of salt marshes from all the way up and down the Atlantic coast, really, from North Florida to here. It was widely thought, based on a paper from 1990, that the northern extent of their range was about Woods Hole, but it turns out that was false. They are native, they're nocturnal, and they're the one crab in the marsh that directly consumes the above and below ground, mostly above, but some below ground vegetation, the actual plants that are growing in the marsh. Of all the millions of fiddler crabs that you see out there, they're much different. They're smaller, they have larger eye stalks, the females have small claws, the males have one big one, one small one. They're the ones you see out in the day. You won't see Sesarma because they're nocturnal. You also see green crabs out in the middle of the day, but they're often submerged. So this is what they do. So at normal populations, their effects are basically unnoticeable. They consume a little bit of the vegetation, which just grows back. When their populations become very large, though, they do this sort of thing. So they're munching away at all this grass to the point where it can't regrow anymore. Once they consume it once, it'll probably regrow a few times, but they just keep consuming it, hordes and hordes of them. And eventually they exhaust their internal reserves and cannot grow anymore, and you end up with bare area, which looks like this. So creek bank edges are a particular favorite habitat of them. And when you see creek bank vegetation loss, it's almost always an indicator of Sesarma herbivory. This is in the West End Marsh and Province Land. How do we know that it's herbivory? Well, you don't see those kinds of, especially creek bank losses, from anything else, really. And you can plant in any of these Sesarma-driven dieback areas where we've lost a ton of vegetation. You can plant plants in there and they'll grow perfectly fine as long as you put them in a cage and exclude them from crab herbivory. If you don't, then you get that situation. They're quickly nibbled down to a nub. That's why we can't replant these areas that have been lost to Sesarma. They'll just eat it back down. Often herbivory looks like this as well. This is a perfect example of how it's not correlated with any kind of environmental gradient like hydrology or like soil chemistry, that sort of thing. So they'll just take out these sections of the creek bank, which often supports the most vigorous Spartina alternifera growth, but that's a very characteristic chunk out of the side of the creek bank effect of Sesarma. So this has been going on a long time. We first started talking about Sesarma or what these big patches of missing vegetation were. We didn't really know back in the early 2000s when a lot of people started getting out into Cape Cod salt marshes and doing rigorous scientific monitoring. But it turns out they've been here for a while, doing their thing for a while. I pulled this picture off the post office of the Harwich Port office there, and it's from 1991, Saquatucket Harbor. You can see extensive loss of vegetation along the mosquito ditches here and along the creek bank as well. Just a little close up there. This is 1995. I got this photo. This stuff in old aerial photography, which is often black and white, it's almost impossible to see. So I was looking for ground level photos. This was a photo artist that specialized in taking pictures of naked people kind of in salt marshes and tidal channels and, you know, in various poses and stuff, but I cut out them. And she happened to catch this 1995, creek bank loss of Sesarma, clearly Sesarma-driven loss there with some remaining little clumps here in 1995. This is Wellfleet Audubon Sanctuary in 2005. We first started exploring this a lot. A really extensive dieback there, but on their brochure of all the lists of different animals that you could find in the sanctuary, the Sesarma weren't on it. And clearly they had already done a ton of damage. This stuff is hard to see, actually, unless you're way out in the marsh with boots on. It's hard to see from the road and in the upland. So currently, Sesarma impacted marshes on Cape Cod. Really kind of all up and down, really every marsh along starting at about the west end, Marsh and Provincetown, along the Cape Cod Bay side in the seashore is heavily impacted. Pamit, all through Wellfleet, all the way down to about Eastham here, and then they sort of disappear, and there's no effects and really no Sesarma impacts all along this north shore. I suspect that they'll eventually migrate that way. The south coast of the east end of Cape Cod is really heavily impacted, and then they're more spotty, but definitely present and doing some damage up through, down towards Falmouth, Woods Hole, and up into Buzzards Bay. I'll just show you some examples of what it looks like. So these are the typical vegetation loss. You can see all this old shoot stubble that's just recently disappeared. There's no standing dead phase of vegetation or dying plants. They're just basically there and gone. And they're not in any of these flooded areas. So sometimes we're seeing vegetation loss in other areas due to permanent flooding and ponding. That's not the case here. This is Boat Meadow Marsh in Eastham. Again, a typical creek bank loss. You can see some clumps still standing here. And you can also see how vigorous Spartina is usually along those creek bank edges. It's very well drained. They receive the first dose of nutrients and sediment and so forth. So it's usually a great habitat for them to grow along here. But Sesarma's denuded all of that. Saquatucket Harbor is pretty much, the marsh is pretty much gone there. It's just algae growing on top of old peat flat. In fact, I can't even go eat dinner at a Brack's Landing there anymore and look at the marsh because it's too depressing for me. Herring River in Harwich, also a system that's pretty impacted. That's just upstream from Route 28. You can see it as you're driving by in your car. Parker River in Yarmouth. Often we see these strips between low marsh alterniflora and high marsh patens. They graze along this edge and they graze along that edge, and it's almost like they're farming them. They let them grow, and I think they like the new shoots that come up. But these barriers are just persistent for long, long periods of time. Lieutenant Island, Wellfleet, extensive damage everywhere. West End, Marsh and Provincetown, Meagan Tyrell from Quite Bay, and I watched this happening from the beginning, but now there's probably about 30 acres of marsh gone completely. It was all totally vegetated back in 2012-ish. Out in Nantucket, they're having problems as well. And other places, not just Cape Cod. Cape Cod's sort of the epicenter of this problem in New England, but they're doing damage up and down the Atlantic coast. This is from the Neck River in Connecticut. That's my shovel with a Sesarma on it. At first, they didn't know what was happening in some of these areas. They're hard to catch. People put traps in the ground, couldn't catch any, but I suspected that it definitely was Sesarma. And the first shovel I put in the ground, I pulled up one of those guys. Same thing's happening in further south, South Carolina, Virginia, where they actually they're expanding these creek heads, which normally terminate into a narrow point. They've done a lot of damage here. So we're not necessarily special in terms of what Sesarma is doing along the East Coast. So why have they become so abundant here? They're sort of roughly 10 times normal population densities. A lot of speculation about this, but some pretty good evidence that they've lost some predation pressure. Some of the recreationally popular sport fish, Connor tautog, striped bass, are predators. They've been depleted. Blue crabs are at the northern extent of their range here. They're not super abundant, but they're also harvested. Black crowned night herons, Alan, they're probably have precipitously declined as well. But there's also other things going on. A recent paper suggested that sea level rise is actually making the sediments up in northeastern marshes, which are often very dense and tight, softer and easier to burrow in. And finally, we've created, I mentioned they love creek bank habitat. So here's Bass River where they've denuded both sides of a mosquito ditch, and we've created a ton of artificial creek bank habitat by ditching most of our marshes. All right, so irrespective of the cause of their big population explosion, their damage is severe and really rapid and permanent. So here's West End Marsh in Provincetown. You can see we're getting this irreversible creek widening, these big chunks. In one storm, winter storm, you can see thousands of years of salt marsh peat development just kind of go away, calve off and fall into the bottom of the tidal channel and get eroded away or oxidized away. Here's a great example of that. The LiDAR elevation data, remotely sensed, it gives you a good bathymetry of creeks. In between 2013 to 2021, you can see how much this creek has expanded because you lose the edge vegetation and all the roots. There's nothing to hold the soil there. anymore. As opposed to, this is a Nauset Marsh where there are no Sesarma and no Sesarma problems. Same with Pleasant Bay. There are two marshes that are sort of free of those problems. You can see that you don't get that kind of creek expansion. Cape wide, we see creek expansion due to sea level rise, but nowhere near the extent to when the creek banks are denuded by Sesarma crabs. They also, when you open up these areas, all the fiddler crabs love these open areas. We did some experiments showing that they actually move in there in droves. They can see each other better. It probably grows soil algae better. So fiddler crabs eat the detritus and soil algae out of the sediment mostly. But they occupy these areas in huge numbers, and they're oxygenating all those sediments, which are then oxidizing all the organic matter in the peat away. So the ground is actually sinking and becoming more compacted. In addition to that, the physical process of erosion on every tide, and in particular during winter storms, as well as heavy precipitation events at low tide, are completely reshaping these open landscapes at this point. Can we manage them? So trapping, can't really do it. They eat the vegetation. So you put traps in here and they don't go in them because there's still lots of vegetation around for them to eat. Why would they go in the trap to eat them? You can catch them using pitfall traps. It's just a tennis ball container or any kind of container sunk in the ground. But it's hard to catch them that way. Megan and I try to catch a lot of them that way. But we had marginal luck. Also, for small areas, you may be able to use these traps and remove them and kind of decrease their numbers. But in terms of, on a marsh-wide scale, for example, it just is not really feasible to do. For example, a 15-acre open area in West End Marsh would, you can debate these numbers, but require about 60,000 tennis ball traps, which have to be emptied every couple days. So not really a way to manage marshes, on a landscape scale. One thing that tells us about what regulates Sesarma is actually substrate, though. So it's kind of a no-brainer, but where there's very sandy substrate, they don't live and there's no vegetation loss. So it's too sandy to support their more elaborate, deeper, complex burrows than fiddler crabs. So they won't live in it. A few feet across the tidal channel where it's all a big peat bank, you can see all the vegetation loss that's happening there. And we can see this naturally with overwash events that have happened. So this is the West End Marsh up in Provincetown. 1995, big overwash event occurred here. This is what it looks like now. But that area is still only 1% organic matter. After all that time being, recolonized by vegetation, it looks like that's nice, healthy, beautiful marsh. But it's still sandy enough to basically exclude Sesarma crabs, even though this part of the marsh is completely decimated by them. 2 minutes remaining. Okay, got to go quickly here. Okay, so if you put Sesarma crabs in peat and sand together in an aquarium, they will only burrow in the peat. Same if you fill flower pots filled with sand or versus the adjacent natural peat that's there in the mud flat. They will not burrow into the sand flower pots. This is at the end of a season with just sand-filled flower pots. They're everywhere, all around it, but they will not burrow in it. That led us to do a little experiment here where we piled 25 centimeter, tried to combine elevation augmentation with this, a specific sediment type. When we piled sand on top of these plots adjacent to unconsumed vegetation in these dieback areas, the vegetation grew back really, really well. So crabs could still get in there. I had to build some rock walls to hold the sand in during the winter at first. The controls had them as well. But there's a Sesarma crab in a plot. There's green crab tracks. There's a fiddler crab in there. So they had access to all this, but no crabs burrowed in that sediment, and no vegetation was eaten. Some examples of control versus sand-added plots here. This vegetation grew so vigorously that clones grew outside. These are attached to the ones in here, so they extended themselves beyond the boundary of where we put the sand. They'll eat all the grasses in the marsh, not the forbs, but the grasses. So this is a disticulus plot. Still another plot in the Western Marsh with some data showing Percent cover greatly increasing in the sand data plots. Here's a control with no walls just to show that, but control sand data plot. And they responded really quickly and did really well to these particular treatments. How long would that sand layer last? When would it become cohesive enough for Sesarma to reoccupy those areas after the vegetation's grown back? Well, probably a long, long time. In this case, West End Marsh, that's still only 1% organic matter. In some other overwash areas, one that happened in Nawson Marsh in 78, in that footprint's only 3.5% organic matter, whereas the other part of the marsh is about 14%. Same in Pleasant Bay. A 2007 overwash, that area is fully vegetated quickly, but it's still only 0.6% organic matter. Not enough to support Sesarma. So theoretically, if you did some kind of sediment augmentation with sand, you could get a lot of decades out of it before they could possibly be recolonized. I'll just end with this. How do you do that on a big, large scale? Like some days it feels like, I won this little personal battle against Sesarma in these little meter squared plots. But yay for me. But how do you translate that to like a broad scale ecological restoration? We're doing big things in coastal areas, and engineers are smart people, but it's kind of mind-boggling to think about how to apply that to big marsh areas. Not saying it can't be done. The Dutch are particularly innovative. They've been building these things called mud motors and sand motors, where they deposit a big pile of some kind of sediment in a strategic place and let waves and currents carry that sediment, either for beach nourishment or in this case for marsh nourishment. So perhaps there's something we could do along those lines. In the meantime, I think in many of these marshes, we'll see a kind of ecosystem state change. All this peat will, with the vegetation loss, will be eroded away or compact down to the underlying sand layer, where you can get some recovery of vegetation, but it's so low compared to the original marsh platform that it'll soon be overtaken by sea level rise and not survive very long. So that's all I have. Thank you.